or in the Teams chat, just fire in your questions. We'll try and get those answered towards the end as well. So a little bit about me on the slide here. So I run a very small Microsoft Gold partner based in the UK. So we focus mainly on sort of consultancy and managed services around the whole Power Platform, Azure, obviously, which is why I'm speaking about it today, obviously, and also bespoke application development as well. So I work primarily with Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform. Got various sort of certifications in there. I won't sort of drone on about those in too much detail. For my sins, I'm also a Prince 2 project manager and a certified Scrum Master. So typically I'll be involved both in terms of as a developer and also as potentially as a project manager on the projects that I'm on as well. I'm also involved as part of the official user group for Dynamics 365. We've got our next virtual meeting happening at the end of the month, so be sure to check that out if you want to get involved. But I don't want to talk about me. I want to make this session about you guys. So I'm really keen just to hear now on either on the sort of the Teams chat or on the YouTube chat. Okay, what is your current experience level with Azure, and what are you hoping to get out of today's session? It'd be really great if you could just sort of in the chat now, just let me know, because we want to try and tailor this around what you need the most, really. So just give people just a few seconds just to get it in the chat. Okay, so Carl's saying hi Carl, you don't really understand subscriptions. Okay, so we can cover that off today, talk about the various different subscriptions. David, security, so we can talk through in terms of how the Azure AD sort of works and things like that. That'll be a good subject for us to dive into. Oh, key vaults. Okay, so we can talk about key vaults, API management, how to grant access to the resources. Okay, so these are all relevant subjects that we can sort of talk about. API management is a very big subject, particularly if you're working things with logic apps as well and things like that. Using key vaults with application lifecycle management. Okay, so DevOps and stuff like that. So I can touch upon that at the end. I've been doing some work recently with that in terms of how you can get them into templates and then deploy them out using DevOps and things like that. Securing APIs. Okay, great. Okay, so maybe towards the end of the session, then we can look at some of the specific API type subjects. That seems to be quite popular at the moment for good reason. Okay, that's great. So thank you, everyone. Let's crack on then. So I guess the big question, first of all, when we're thinking about Azure, how can it assist us? Is this really huge big thing that sort of has some involvement with Dynamics 365, the Power Platform? You can do so much with it, but how can it sort of benefit you? What are the benefits of embracing it? Well, really, if you're coming from a traditional sort of traditional approach for your IT infrastructure, so you've either got server racks in your business or you're renting server space out from a big hosting company, the main benefit that Azure can bring to the table is about delivering transformation to your data center. So moving you away perhaps from sort of bare metal type situations where you've got servers on racks, and instead going down the managed services route so that you can introduce efficiencies by using the latest platform as a service, software as a service type offerings. Another key benefit as well, it's about getting insight. So not just I guess from a performance standpoint necessarily, but also from a cost basis as well. So being able to sort of tell very quickly in terms of, okay, how much is this particular service costing me each month, and is that sort of meeting our expectations in terms of a benefit? So regardless of any type of metric that you're wanting to sort of delve into from an Azure standpoint, there's going to be plenty of reporting tools at your disposal that's going to help you unlock those insights, which is really great. Mobility is a key one these days, particularly for larger organizations, who are looking to sort of become more innovative, becoming more nimble in their approaches. When you start embracing Azure and all of the tools around it in terms of Azure DevOps, application lifecycle management, things like that, you can really start to be a lot more mobile. You can get things deployed far quicker and therefore have much more greater returns to the business as a consequence. Internet of Things, again, that's another huge thing at the moment. It's so you've got various different tools as part of Azure that can help you build out those type of services or solutions. And finally, it's all about innovation. So being able to within a few short seconds spin up an Azure function app, a serverless function app that you can just quickly deploy your code out into, it doesn't become rocket science for you to start embracing this stuff. It's literally in most cases just a few clicks, push a deploy button, done. And now we're being super innovative in terms of how we're doing things, which is fantastic for us and for the business as well. But when you're looking at it for the first time, when you're looking at the amount of different services on there, it is a lot to consume. So there's just a small flavor in here in terms of some of the things that you've got on there. But really, there's over 600 different services available today. So it can be a little bit tricky sometimes identifying, okay, what's the best, where do I need to go? What do I need to find to sort of do this? And as a consequence, we don't invest time in finding out more about it, and we potentially miss a great opportunity. So I think the thing I always say with Azure, it's impossible to know everything about it. So just accept that you're never going to be an expert in it. Just dip into the areas that are most relevant to you, and don't be daunted. Don't be sort of shocked in terms of the hugeness of it when you first look at it. So a few sort of fun facts in terms of Azure, why it's particularly relevant. Well, as a matter of fact, if you are currently a Dynamics 365 and Office 365 customer, then you're already using Azure. Okay, so all of your Dynamics 365 instances, they're going to be set up on, I believe, Azure Service Fabric, virtual machines in the background. If you're using portals, Power Apps portals, they're using Azure App Service with some geo-replication application gateways there to sort of do that. And things such as virtual agent for customer service, that's using Azure Bot Service underneath the hood. All that Microsoft have done is just provided a more accessible layer for you to then use that. So 9 times out of 10, if you're using something within the Power Platform, there's going to be Azure sitting underneath the hood. So that's great, because what we can say straight away is that we're Azure experts. We're using technologies which are built on Azure. So, it's not going to be too difficult for us to sort of, dive in a little bit further and see what else we can get out of it. In terms of other things that are interesting, so in terms of the number of regions, this may not be correct because it's changing all the time, but it's available in at least 54 regions in over 140 countries. Microsoft are adding more and more data centers regions all the time. So whether you need to have an application that's hosted in either in the UK or in Australia, or you'll have both, you can potentially build a solution that is truly global in scale using the power of Azure. So this one is a bit more relevant towards the back end of last year, but if you are potentially running legacy technology, so specifically SQL Server 2008 or Windows Server, if you do just a very simple lift and shift of those into Azure, then Microsoft are going to give you extended security support for those products. So potentially a really great way. If you're trying to get things, modernize your estate, but you're just not quite there, you need to continue running these legacy systems, then getting them onto Azure is a great way to not only speed things along, but also make sure that you're not going to be left out in the cold if there's a major issue, ransomware or something like that again in the future. And last year it was confirmed that the US Pentagon is actually going to be using Azure as part of their Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure project, which is really great. That was a really big win for Microsoft when that came in. So when we look at that, it's fair to say, the force is very strong with Azure. It's a really fantastic tool. Why else would the US Pentagon want to go with it? And as a consequence, if you're coming from a Dynamics 365 background, it's really, really important that you have a good awareness in terms of what it can do. Not so much in terms of the deep technical level detail in terms of what it can do, but just being able to sort of understand, okay, if a customer comes to me with a particular requirement, okay, what is the best sort of Azure service or Azure area that I need to turn towards in order to try and meet that particular requirement. So in terms of some specific examples, we'll just cover off a few here if you are working with Dynamics 365. So a common one may be, okay, well, if you wanted to sort of get your data out of the common data service, get it into either an Azure SQL database for backup or reporting purposes, or to export out into Data Lake, that is now possible. You set up the appropriate resources in Azure, and your data can be synchronized out on a fairly regular schedule, which is really good. So if you've got potentially very complex business logic, maybe the type of stuff that won't typically be suited well for a plugin because of sandbox limitation issues, using the Azure Service Bus, you can actually just completely take that entire logic, execute it in its own isolated environment that you control the performance of outside of Dynamics 365, but still have access to the same sort of messages, the same sort of functionality as if you were writing a typical plugin. So that's really quite important. If you've done any work with sandbox limitations or plugins, sometimes you do hit that barrier in terms of the 2-minute execution time of things quite quickly. If you want to do more advanced, enterprise integration type scenarios, so maybe sort of you've been doing some stuff with Power Automate flows, but you need to start to formalize that. You need to start doing some automation around it. Then Azure Logic Apps is the solution that you can look at to do that. And it's very, very easy to just export out your Power Automate flows, get them into Azure. They're using the same technology underneath the hood. That transition is fairly seamless. Now, potentially, if you're looking at things such as CRM portals, Power Apps portals, for example, cost may be a particular issue. Maybe some of the functionality isn't quite there in terms of what you need for the business. So that's where maybe you can look at developing your own bespoke application that you can then deploy out to your own app service instance. You can write this using any particular language or tool that you want. So whether it's a .NET or maybe something else, perhaps. And maybe if you want to then get some really great, beautiful visualizations as part of that, you can then bring Power BI embedded into the equation. So this is similar to the Power BI online service. What it lets you do is you can put the various Power BI visualizations in your bespoke application. So really make them look a lot cooler than potentially they would look if you were using some of a library or things like that. A big subject, one that I speak about quite a lot, to a sort of almost ranting degree, Azure Data Factory. So if you're doing anything in terms of modern ETL type processes these days, particularly if it's targeting Dynamics 365 with a common data service, you need to be looking at Azure Data Factory. So there's a great session earlier today where an intro session around Azure Data Factory, what it can do, its features, benefits. I would encourage you to take a look at that, particularly if you are wedded to SSIS and things like that. Azure Data Factory is really going to become the main tool that we use moving forward for not just ETLs, but also maybe slightly more complex integration scenarios. If you want to do anything with Azure Cognitive Services in terms of running more advanced AI type services, then again, this can be set up in Azure. It's fully accessible as part of tools such as Power Automate Flows or Power Apps. You can get the details from there, store them in CDS. That's really great. And then when it comes to automation, so if you've got, let's say, quite a large deployment, so maybe multiple common data service tenants, you need to do common administrative tasks fairly regularly. So, for example, taking a backup of the production instance, restoring this to test, so that you've got a fairly production-like system in there. Then Azure Runbooks can be used to automate that. And when you start using some of the PowerShell scripts that are available as part of that, you can introduce a lot of automation there. And the key thing as part of that is taking the manual human intervention out of the equation. Not that we don't want to, potentially, not give people a job to do, but you want people to be working smart. And running things manually, there's always that risk of human intervention. Now, the great thing about all of this is that it's not necessarily something that you're going to be if you use all of this, you're going to be charged thousands of pounds or dollars each month to sort of consume. A lot of these will be consumption based. So you only pay for what you use. So if you're running a Logic Apps 5 times per month, you only pay for that. And even then, because of how the pricing works, typically it's only when you start using things in the sort of the hundreds or thousands each month that you start to see bills appearing on your bill. So so potentially all of this really powerful, great enterprise grade technology can be used for sort of the price of a few cups of coffee per month potentially. And that's really great, because we want to be doing great things technology wise, but we've always potentially got somebody, an accountant or a potentially a finance director breathing down the neck around the costs. So that's really important. Azure enables us to sort of do that. So we'll look at some of the benefits then. So let's jump in now. Let's look at some of the fundamental things that you need to grasp, and then we'll jump into a quick demo. We'll create something out into Azure and show you how you can do that. So accessing it, so that's the most important thing. First of all, how do I get into Azure? Well, the portal is probably going to be your main way, your first way in which you sort of dip your toe into it. So through there, you basically manage all your resources using something called Azure Resource Manager. So in here, you can create, update, delete, review your resources, manage your billing preferences, manage your alerts. Most common tasks will be available and can be done through the portal. If you're working on the go, then there's also mobile applications as well that you can use that lets you just quickly, again, do the same type of things. When you're sort of moving, away from the basics, you want to do things, in a bit more smarter or maybe automated way. This is when you start looking at maybe other tools to connect into Azure. So you've got modules for PowerShell that you can use. You can use CLI commands if that's your thing. You've got REST API fully exposed out. There's various different mechanisms that developers can use to go into the platform and do these common tasks: create a resource, update a resource, get its details, etc., etc., etc. This is how the Azure portal looks. We're going to jump in a little bit later on and we'll create a few sample resources, see how that process looks in there. But it's really quite straightforward to sort of see on there. You've got all your common services at the top up there. You can navigate down to subscriptions, resource groups. You've got links to various different resources, the mobile app, etc. It's really quite easy and accessible to get into. So when we speak about Azure, we talk about this concept called the resource manager. So what is this? So this basically is the sort of how everything's managed from an Azure level. So when you're creating a web app, a Azure SQL database, a virtual machine, these are all classed as resources, and they're managed at the platform level via resource groups. So we're going to touch upon those in a little bit more detail, but what that effectively means is that you can group together your various resources into logical or semi-logical groupings, based on functionality or business area, things like that. Around that, you've got a really powerful and effective authentication mechanism, so you can make sure that only the people who need access to these resources have actually got them, and restrict it out if you need to. And then in terms of getting into the resource manager, working with the various resources, again, you use these tools that we spoke about already, so whether it's the portal, PowerShell, etc. These all let you get into the resource manager to start working with your resources. So in order to start working with resources, creating your first resource group, you need to first of all have a subscription. This is a really mandatory requirement. So even if you're just experimenting for the first time, you're going to need to have either a free trial or subscription provision for you. And this must exist within a Azure Active Directory or Office 365 tenant. The great thing is we can have multiple different subscriptions. There's no limit around that. And the type of subscription really would depend in terms of how your organization is potentially consuming Azure. So in most cases, if you're just trialing things for the very first time, you may go for a pay-as-you-go subscription. So all you need to get started with this is just a credit card, a valid credit card. You can change this so you're invoiced instead, but typically credit card is the preferred way of doing that. If you have got either a Visual Studio subscription or Microsoft partner, then you have access to sort of a set amount of a subscription with an allotted amount access to you each month. So it varies based on what Visual Studio plan that you've got. So for example, Visual Studio Enterprise, you get $150 a month credit subscriptions, I believe. But again, that's another great way. If you're not using that already, if you've got your Visual Studio subscription or your Microsoft partner and you're not using these benefits, then get them activated and start experimenting, because you'll potentially miss an opportunity there. Another way in which you consume Azure is via cloud solutions provider. So this is where you work with a Microsoft partner. They provision and manage the subscriptions on your behalf. Typically, they will manage your support requests and billing information around that. That will generally be probably the preferred way in which you consume Azure in the future, now and in the future. So definitely try and work with a CSP where you can. It does help you along a bit. And then for large scale organizations, if you've got an enterprise agreement with Microsoft, then potentially that might be something where you can agree with Microsoft and again get a bit of a discount as well if you're a high volume user around that. So what you will typically find is if you're going down the CSP or EA route, then this may typically be cheaper. So it's always worth aligning yourself with one of those two if you're starting to get serious with Azure. And depending on what subscription offer you go for will also dictate in terms of what support offering that you've got potentially around that. So for pay-as-you-go, what you will have to do is pay more to get access into technical support around your subscription. So you get basic support of all subscriptions. So that but that typically only covers, billing inquiries or things of that nature, account level type queries. If you need technical support, you need the ability to be able to open a ticket and get help with Azure API management, for example, then you're going to have to make sure you've got a support package in there that can accommodate that. Another thing to sort of bear in mind, that it's getting to the point now where it's not as applicable as before, but you do have to sometimes pay attention. Certain resource types will only be available based on the type of subscription that you've got. So traditionally, there was quite a few limitations around cloud solutions provider subscriptions in terms of what resources you couldn't deploy out to them. Microsoft have generally fixed that this year, so there's quite broad parity, but it's always worth just double checking and making sure that you're, if you are deploying out, let's say, Azure Active Directory domain services, for example, just make sure that it's supported for the subscription that you want to go for. Okay, so resource groups. So we touched upon this already. So this is your logical groupings. This is where you collect together your various different resources, and typically they will be related in some fashion. So as I said earlier, grouped by sort of a functional area, grouped by a business area. Really just use them how you see fit. I guess as with anything, just make sure you're being consistent with the usage. So so with your subscription set up and deployed, you then create these at the subscription level. They always must be associated to a specific Azure region, such as UK South, North America, etc. That's just a requirement as part of that. And there's really no exceptions around this in terms of every single resource that you create in Azure must be tagged to a single resource group, and there's very little exceptions around this. Now, the great thing about them is that if you do need to have some control in terms of who can access a resource group, you can control this at the Azure Active Directory level, and you've got some quite granular controls around this. And if you do decide, okay, well, I want to move this resource group to another subscription, so maybe you've started out as pay-as-you-go and you've moved across to an enterprise agreement, you can do that. Just there is some sort of small caveats around that. Certain specific resources might not be movable in that circumstance. So just check the fine print, read the documentation. Microsoft Docs is a great resource for that. And the worst case scenario might be you just have to recreate a resource from scratch and redeploy out the resources. Okay, resources. So this is the bit that does something useful. Or if you're like me and you're playing around with Azure, you forget to turn something off. This is where you sort of have the shock moment on your credit card statement and you realize, oh no, I forgot to turn that off. So just they typically will always be, as I said, tied to a single resource group and a location. So the location for a resource will matter. Resource group locations don't really matter. So for example, if you have a resource group that's in UK South, you can have resources that are in that resource group that are in different regions. So it doesn't really matter. Whereas with the individual resources, when you deploy that out, it's basically saying, okay, I'm going to deploy this out into this data center in this region, in this country. So just keep that in mind in terms of when it comes to, if you're subject to data residency requirements or things like that, just keep that in mind. It's at the resource level where it really starts to matter. Now, some resources may be restricted by regions, so just keep that in mind. You might not, not all data centers have all potential resources available, so just make sure you keep that in mind. Again, you've got the same capabilities in terms of being able to move resources across different resource groups. Again, that's caveated to a certain degree. There may be some limitations, so just consult the documentation around that if that ever becomes a requirement for that. And I think just to watch out for, so when you deploy certain types of resources, Azure will sometimes go in the back end and deploy out hidden resources that you have to basically expose out in order to view in detail. So in most cases, these will be dependent required components. You really must handle these with care. Don't be deleting them if unnecessarily. So just keep that in mind when you're sort of working with that. And in terms of all resources, when you're working with them, they'll always have these set features as standard. So, for example, activity log is available, so you can view, what people and what's happened to that resource over time. You've got rich access control policies similar to resource groups. You can use tagging to be able to classify or label your resources. You can view base properties such as IDs and things like that. And a final option, which is really helpful if you're doing anything with Azure DevOps, is that you can export out a resource. You can extract either the JSON, PowerShell, or CLI definition for that, and very quickly get that integration as part of your ALM systems. So permissions security then. So this is arguably perhaps one of the greatest features that Azure has, particularly when you compare it to other cloud providers. And the reason for this is that it's using Azure Active Directory as the backbone for all of this. So the benefits of this are fairly clear if you've done anything at all with Office 365 or things like that. So for example, it gives you that full single sign-on capability. You've got full role-based access controls that you can implement. You can easily bring in and leverage additional AAD features to secure your resources. So for example, whether it's multi-factor authentication, disabling legacy authentication, all that sort of stuff can be brought in. So really by having that as the backbone for Azure, it really helps us when we're managing our permissions and security. And the great thing is that this can be scoped to any particular AAD object. Crucially as well, this is quite important and useful when it comes to working with managed identities or service principals. So for example, so let's say you've got, an Azure app service and a SQL database. I can grant that Azure app service, the managed identity ID for that app service, access into my SQL database as a service principal user, and then grant it the permissions that it needs. So therefore, I'm not having to be in a situation where I'm managing passwords in plain text and having to update that per environment. I can go passwordless, I can use my managed identities, and that also helps when it comes to automating things as well. So always try and use managed identities where you can in Azure. It really will help you along a lot. So in terms of checking permission in the portal, we've got the ability in there to be able to do that very quickly, just a couple of clicks process, and we can tell for any specific object, okay, what permissions have they got in there. And we can grant a variety of different role assignments across it, and we've got a few out of the box ones that can help us with that. So for example, I can grant just read privileges to a resource group, to Jane, for example. I can deny John from accessing a SQL Server resource that's nothing to do with him. And let's say Alan, I want him to be able to create runbooks, but I don't want him to modify or delete them once they've been created. So again, all of these permissions and more can be sort of managed and specified at the Azure level, which really gives us that granular control that we need. Okay, so with that in mind, then let's jump into the Azure portal, and we'll create some resources, see how we go about that process. So go jump into my browser down here. So we're going to go in via the portal route up here, portal.azure.com. So as you can see on here, I've got a few different resources on here at the moment. So I get a grid on here that shows me everything that's been set up previously for my particular tenant, which is really useful. I can navigate down to particular areas down here. So for example, all resources shows me everything that I've got on here. So quite a few different things. But first of all, bit we want to check first of all is subscription. So this is what you would typically want to set up for the first time when you're working with Azure. So you can see on here, I'm using a Visual Studio Professional subscription as part of that. If I wanted to add on a new subscription, I just click this button up here, and it's going to open up a page where it tells me the various different subscription offers that I can potentially go for. Just get logged in via multi-factor. Bear me 2 seconds. 148354. Give that a second to load up. So what appears on this list will differ based on whether you've done a free trial or not already at the moment down here, but we can see I've got access to a free trial, so I can get a set amount of a set monetary value that I can use to start experimenting with Azure. I can go straight in and just put in the credit card details and start paying for that. And I can also set up support options as well. So you've got various different support plans that, again, you'll need to factor in when you set up the subscription if you need that technical support, particularly if you're going down the pay-as-you-go route. Okay, so I've got my subscription there ready to go. So let's create a resource group and get started first of all. So click on resource group up there, click on add, and we'll create a new resource group. So we'll call this one our 365 Saturday. And we'll select UK South for this one. Where's it gone? Here we go. So I think just which we'll touch upon towards the end as well, but tags are also really potentially very useful if you use them correctly. So these can be queried at the sort of the API level. And help you be able to sort of, run a report very quickly to say, okay, well, how much are my resources with so-and-so tag, costing me each month. So I can set up tags of any particular type. So I'll just call this one event, and we'll call this 365 Saturday, for example. And again, I can have as many of these as I want. So I really would encourage you to use tags where possible. They really will help you a lot, and again provide that visibility, so when somebody's looking at a resource for the first time, they know what it's doing, they know what it is, and there's no confusion around that. Okay, so we're going to create that, and that process is fairly quick. So straight away we've got our resource group down here. We can see it's applied our tag up here for the particular one on there, and we've got access to some common options down here. So one of them will be our properties, for example. So here, this will be available for pretty much all subscriptions. So the bits that potentially from a developer standpoint will be quite useful if you're working with the API. It'll be things such as your resource ID. So typically it'll always follow a pattern similar to this. So if you ever need to go in and, okay, well, how, what's a resources ID so I can query it programmatically through the API, this is the area that you go to. And again, this will always be common based on, regardless of which resource type that you work with on Azure. Okay, so we've got our resource group set up and ready. So let's create a resource. So let's see what we can create. So I'm going to create let's create API management service. Let's do that. Been doing quite a bit of work with this recently. So at this point, we're going to do create. Up there, we get a little overview. So in most cases, you'll have common properties that you need to fill out. So name, subscription, resource group, and location. From there, you'll then go down into various different settings depending on the resource type. So we'll call this 365 Saturday demo. It's probably going to be taken. That must be a letter. Okay, let's do Saturday Powerthon 365 demo. Let's do that. Not sure if I'm spelling that correctly, but never mind. So we're going to put that into our resource group UK South again. We'll call this 365 Saturday. Administrator email, things like that. Pricing tier. So for this one, we're going to go for developer on this, although I will need to remove that probably at some point. We can see down here that consumption tier is not available. I thought it was available for UK South, but we can see here we've got a limitation. So in which case we must go for developer down here. We're not going to enable application insights down there. Now at this point we could just click create, but if we were wanting to interrogate and see, okay, well what does the JSON definition for this look like? How can I create this via PowerShell? I can click this button down here, automation options, and it's going to spit out a template that's basically good and ready to go. So it's a very simple template. It gives us some parameters that we have to sort of specify at runtime, so name, location, etc. And this is the bit here that we care about. This is what will be created when it's targeting an API management service down there. So we're not going to worry too much about that for now. Oh, we're going to have to start again. Okay, let's do this again. 365 Saturday, and we'll just create this resource through the portal instead. So this is the bit that may typically take some time to deploy. It really does vary based on the resource type that you're working with. The great thing is that we can track the deployment at any time by clicking the button up here. And we can see that it's going through the motions at the moment, getting it deployed out. And through this area as well, we can also see, okay, well, what's actually gone in as part of building this out. So we can see basically the template that we saw earlier is visible down there. So regardless of how you're deploying your resources out to Azure, whether it's through the portal as we've just done, or whether you're doing, let's say, a DevOps task, it will always create a deployment at the Azure level. And then from there, we can start to then dig in and see how things are performing, whether things are erroring, view the base template and things like that. So whilst that's deploying out, then we'll take a quick look at some of the security options that you've got around this. So again, this is one of the common properties that you'll find on every single different resource type on here. Access control IAM down there. So as you see, we've got options down here to be able to check access for any particular user on the tenant. So for example, I can pop my email address in on there. Straight away, it's going to find me on there. It's going to tell me, okay, well, I'm a co-administrator on here, so I can do pretty much whatever I want. which is good. If we want to grant on new additional role assignments, we can do this down here. So for example, if we were to, let's say, do a new role assignment down here, we were to sort of maybe select a different account down here somewhere. So maybe just grant maybe that user group particular access, we can do. Deny assignments are also managed down here as well. Classic administrators is probably something that you won't really work with too much down there. Typically you do this via the new role-based access controls instead. But you've got some really powerful and capable features down here that you can use to control who can access your Azure resources. As I mentioned earlier, you've got the ability of being able to sort of dip in and see how things are performing from a cost management point of view, making sure that you're not going overspend or anything like that. So this particular point, there's nothing on here that's particularly useful at this resource group level. If I was to go up, let's say, back onto my subscription level, I'll probably have some more useful information that we can see down here. Yep, so as we can see, we get a nice little graph down here that shows us our uses across the month. We can see that in this particular case, we've actually had a bit of a peak up there for some reason. So that might be something, okay, well, what's happened in this period here? What's forced this up by such a large degree? We might want to go away and investigate that. We can see down there in terms of the various different services, we can drill down and click on and just see, okay, what specific resource is costing me so much? What's the region? What's the resource group name? You've got some really powerful capabilities on here. It'll even give us a forecast and tell us, okay, based on this, we think that by the end of the next period, you're going to have £50 spent on this particular subscription. If we're feeling a bit more sort of budget conscious in terms of what we want to actually be told straight away when we're going over, we can click on the budgets tab down here. So you can see in this particular case, I've got a alert that tells me on here that, okay, if my billing spend goes over £90 for the month, send me an email straight away, because I want to go in and just inspect that a bit further. So you can have multiple email addresses that are tagged on here, get those alerts through straight away, which is really helpful. At this level as well, you can access your invoices, partner information, you can align across there as well. Lots of different options as well. So I think the resource is probably still deploying out. From memory, I think they sometimes take a while, these, but let's have a look. Yeah, might take a little bit of a while. So whilst we're waiting for that, we'll dip back in once it's been created, give it a few more minutes, but we'll jump back to the slides for now and then come back once that's all sort of done and sorted.
Just a quick question from me. Is there any specific reason why you had to use the Visual Studio subscription?
In this case, I used it because I've got access to Visual Studio subscription. So if I was, let's say, experimenting for the first time, maybe I'd set up a free trial, maybe I'd set up a pay-as-you-go subscription with a credit card.
Yeah, because I know in terms of creating things like the JSON, you would need the Visual Studio. Is that correct?
If you're creating, yeah, that's right. So if you work with ARM template projects, then typically you would use Visual Studio to manage that.
Yeah.
You've got a project template in there for Azure Resource Manager that you can use. You don't necessarily have to. You could just copy, paste, stick the JSON files in your repo, and then just deploy them from there. But I would recommend that you use the Visual Studio template project because it gives you some nice options around that to help you develop further.
Thanks.
Okay, so in terms of the key value propositions around Azure, then what are they? So, really, when we're working with any cloud vendor, we want that consistent level in terms of our support and our relationship. Azure gives you that. It's all managed by Microsoft. It's a familiar and process regardless of what type of issue you need to escalate regarding the platform. So therefore, it's going to make it easier for us to manage that. It's an integrated it's integrated offering, but it can cater towards a vast majority of different needs. So whether you're an organization looking to have some virtual machines on there, or you want to develop your own product that sits on top of Azure, you've got the ability to use that with the tools on there. Regardless of whether you're working with infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service, you've got the capability to use Azure in some shape or format. You're not necessarily tied in with one particular organization when you're working with Azure. There are many different partners, globally that you can work with, so don't, you can very quickly change things around if things aren't working for you. You've got, Microsoft is, probably a leader when it comes to, hybrid cloud. You've got lots of nice options that can help you integrate your on-premise and cloud resources. These days, Azure is very strong in terms of not just in terms of from a development platform, but in terms of, supporting a vast majority of different, development languages and tools. So whether you're .NET or Java or Python, Azure is going to support you with that. It's using the tools that we're familiar with from Office as well, best in class. Azure AD certainly is, I'd argue. Gives you that common enterprise layer, some really great industry-leading security, privacy, and compliance tools. So really, I would say that Microsoft has consistently been ahead when it comes to, addressing challenges around GDPR and things like that. They provide a very solid set of tools, and it's built in as part of it. So you don't need to worry about, going through a massive exercise each time. Okay, does this tool tick these boxes from a GDPR standpoint? It's always going to be consistent, which helps us in embracing these tools a lot quicker. And again, we touched on this before, native single sign-on, so not having to fiddle about with different accounts and passwords. You can fully integrate it end to end, which is really nice. Okay, so some general tips and tricks then that I'd sort of advise when you're getting started for the first time. So we saw earlier the really great cost per analysis tools that are available at the portal level. Use these. They will give you some really great insights in terms of, okay, what's costing me the most each month, and not only that, but also, point you towards, okay, could I be doing things, in a better and cheaper way as well? There's always ways in which you can improve things in that regard when it comes to Azure. When you're working with PowerShell and Azure, make sure you're using the new AZ module. This is going to be the supported module to use moving forward. You can still use Azure RM, the old module, as part of your projects, but it's not the one that's going to see investments. And the AZ PowerShell module is a lot easier. It's a lot easier on your fingers when you type it out. There's less that you need to write each time effectively. So make sure you use that. The great thing as well in terms of Azure is that there's loads of different samples out there, so really, get on GitHub, have a look at what's on there. For pretty much every different service on there, there will be a corresponding template or a sample available that within just 2 clicks you can deploy straight out, see how it's working, and that's really helpful when we're just doing that exploratory look into Azure for the first time. We mentioned around our Azure tags, they're really important. Use them to your benefit around that. And then, when you're starting to get really serious, you decide, okay, I want to be in a committed relationship with you, Azure. You're ticking all my boxes. This is really fantastic. This is when you can start to look at Azure templates. And we've touched upon this already, using Visual Studio projects, using pipelines in Azure. These will help you automate things. And, make sure that, in just one click, you can deploy out your entire, Azure estate or infrastructure, for either just testing, for disaster recovery reasons, whatever reasons that you want. It just makes things, increases visibility and makes you a lot more leaner and agile as an organization, which is really important. Okay, so let's just see if that's finished creating. Oh, no, it hasn't. Okay, they can take a while sometimes, these API management resources, so we'll probably just leave that for now. I'm just conscious of time as well, so I'm quite keen just to jump in now and obviously answer any questions that have sort of come through. So I'm just looking at the chat now. Are we good for time, Narayan?
Yeah, we still got 15 minutes. So we got a couple of questions coming in, so let's take that while the resource is getting deployed. Yep. So Ian asked for how can it distribute the cost along different cost centers, so which you demoed, there is a tags, you can assign that. But his question is around do tags shows on our bills?
No, they won't. So I believe that your bill will just show your total spend across your whole subscription. So what you would need to do is probably run a report on Azure, filter that out by your tags. From there, you can then view graphs or export the information in spreadsheet or CSV format.
Excellent. So another question we have is from Param, asking about he's always worked with AWS, and very new to Azure. So Param, I have actually provided that link where you can actually compare the resources between Azure and AWS and kickstart your career with Azure as well.
Yep.
So the next question we have from Devi, is it Azure function that can be used to execute complex business logic outside of the application or Azure service bus?
Well, you can use both. So Azure function is for sort of your stateless applications. So if you're in a situation where you want to go down the consumption route, so you've got, let's say, a bit of C# code or PowerShell script or something that needs to run maybe a couple of times each month, then Azure function is probably a great one to look at. You then just expose out an endpoint, a HTTP endpoint, and then from there execute the function, and that's going to be really cost effective as an option. I think Azure Service Bus will be for situations where you need full access into so if you wanted to trigger actions, so off, let's say, messages in the application, and use the same type of SDK operations that you would typically have available as part of your plugins, that's when you would have to look at a Azure Service Bus, I'd say.
Absolutely, and they both are different in nature as well. Like Azure Service Bus is more like if you want FIFO kind of mechanism where first in and first out messaging, or pub and sub architecture. It's really useful where the logic apps or functions, or pretty much you can orchestrate all your business logic in it and the validation. So yeah, great. So we have next question from Benedict. How do I use PowerShell scripts and ARM template to deploy resources?
So with your PowerShell scripts, you'll have a set of commandlets which so you can either do it in two ways in PowerShell. You can either just you have commandlets that can create a specific resource. So you'll have, for example, create AZ web app, let's say. I can't remember the exact syntax off my head. And then as part of calling that commandlet, you then feed in the various different values that you want as part of that. You can also within PowerShell deploy out all of your resources from a template file. So again, there's a relevant command for that. Create AZ template deployment, I think it is, or something. You just then tell it, okay, where's the JSON file? Give it the path to that. Deploy out everything in the JSON file for you. In terms of the ARM templates as well, again, you can deploy those out through Visual Studio. So if you've got a Azure template project in Visual Studio, you can just do right-click deploy from there. If you're working from DevOps, then you've got specific tasks there to be able to deploy your resource. So Azure resource group deployments that you can use there.
Fantastic. We got another question. Apology, it shows only email address, so I cannot pronounce the name. But it says, can you move resources to other resource group? And I think this is the question I get at pretty much every sessions I have attended or presented. So over to you, Joe.
Yes, the answer is yes. It's a yes, but so in most cases, most resources will support the operation to be able to move that. There is a specific list of exclusions to that. So off the top of my head, things such as, let's say, I think Azure AD domain services can't be moved once it's been created. There might be certain configurations of virtual machines. So I think if you've got virtual machines with full disk encryption enabled, again, you can't move that across. So in those situations, what you would have to do is completely recreate the resource from scratch and then migrate across any configuration code, etc. as part of that.
Excellent. We got 10 minutes. Do you want to quickly check on the deployment before we pick up more questions? Or?
Yeah, we can do, although it seems to still be doing it.
Still doing it. Okay.
Still doing it. It's usually like this API management. Yeah, so let's deal with some more questions. I can see that we've got some more in the chat, haven't we?
We have, yeah.
Okay, so I think
Carl
go on.
saying, yeah, curious to learn more about ADF, especially pulling data from BC and Dynamics 365 CE. Any top tips working with OData data sources?
Okay, hi Carl. So with ADF, you've got the ability in there to be able to run web requests in there. So you could, in theory, call an OData endpoint and pull the data in from via sort of that mechanism. So that option is there. I'm pretty sure that ADF should have a connector for Business Central, although from memory, I think I was chatting to to Matt about this. I think it's a case that you have to expose out like a bespoke endpoint, don't you? Basically, Business Central is rubbish, I think, when it comes to thing on there. But yeah, I would look at the web request task in there, see if you can basically connect up through there, pull the data in via JSON, and then transform it further from there.
Yeah. Also, I would recommend like look into dual write, which is actually a coming up feature. So, have a look into that one. There are lots of resources available online. So next question about from Devi. How do we use API management with an external API hosted on cloud or on premise? I think I would say Wagner did really good presentation, so I would recommend David to look at that recording once it's available. Joe, if you have anything else to say on it.
So API management works on the basis of you have a backend URL that you need to specify. So it's always going to be a case that so long as the backend URL is exposed out, you should be able to access on it. So if it's internet facing, then it shouldn't be an issue. If it's on premise, then I might be wrong, but I don't think you've got the ability to be able to use things like on-premise gateway or things like that. So I think the only option there would be that you would maybe have to you'd have to have a bespoke app service that's using the I forget what it's called. The app service has got like an on-premise connector that you can use, that you can export those out ports and stuff and things like that. So I think if it's cloud and you can't expose it out, then you're going to have to look at probably doing something like that, I'd say.
Great. We have one more question from Ian. If you have an on-prem app that needs to connect to an instance in Azure by IP address, how do you follow if it gets moved? Not quite sure your question, but every Azure resource we actually deploy, it has a unique domain address generated. Is that correct, Joe?
That's correct, and it depends. Certain resources will also let you whitelist and blacklist potential hosts based on IP address. So I would have thought in most cases, if it's coming from on-premise, you should have ideally have a static IP address where possible. That's going to help you simplify that. If it's a case that your IP address is always changing, there's not much you can get around that in order to be able to sort of do that. I think you'd have to look at getting a static address that gets resolved out in some way, perhaps.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, Azure services actually, there are a list of IP addresses provided by Azure. If your organization like to whitelist all of those IP addresses, which will be really better, but also you can actually open up those IP addresses per region as well. So there are categorizations. They do change time to time, but not that frequently. In my experience, I have seen hardly any changes once in a year or maybe once in a 2 year. So they don't try to change those IPs very frequently.
Yeah, there's a file you can download, isn't there? Basically, if you want your brain to be fried by the most hugest JSON file that you've ever seen before, then yeah, download that. There are a lot of different IP addresses. So Ian's just come back saying we have issues when Microsoft moves our Dynamics instance. Okay, so again, it might be as Narayan was saying that you'd have to download the list of all of the different possible IP addresses that Azure uses for your particular region, if you know what the region is, and then just whitelist that on your firewall side.
So particularly with the Dynamics instance, just to add, not only the Azure IP addresses, but there are specific IP addresses for the Dynamics instances as well. You need to look out for those as well. So there are like XML files available, JSON files available, which you can download and extract the unique IP addresses and range. Make sure you apply the full range, not the individual single IP addresses. So it might say /21 or /23 or something like that. It's 24.
Ian, if you stick around in the chat, once we finish, I'll find the links for you and I'll put them in the chat for you, so you've got those.
Yeah, just a quick question from myself. So, to what extent can you automate like the deployment of resource groups and resources itself? So I know that I've just been having a conversation with my brother recently, and he's been talking about using Terraform to kind of automate all that, creation of resource groups and like virtual machines and all that kind of stuff. To what extent can you do all of that in terms of even determining what sort of environments, software applications will be installed, say using of Docker and all that kind of stuff as well?
Yeah, so Azure supports Docker, Kubernetes, Terraform, basically most of the major ones it supports. So if you need to deploy out, let's say, a virtual machine, that's running, Nginx, Windows Server 2012, whatever the configuration is, you've got the ability of doing that. So typically what you would do, you'd have to store your configuration for that within Azure DevOps. You then have a corresponding template or PowerShell CLI script that creates the resource for you. And then as part of creating the resource, you then reference your image, your configuration for your particular application.
Fantastic. Right. We're looking at like in a 3 minutes time now. So apology if anyone has a question and we couldn't answer. Joe, do you want to quickly look at the resource got deployed so we can utilize this 3 minutes?
It probably hasn't, no.
It hasn't.
So yeah, I was hoping they'd be able to select the consumption one to show you off. But so anyway, so apologies we weren't able to get around to sort of seeing that. But again, I hope this has been useful. I'm going to be around all day. So in the chat, or just you can feel free to reach out to me on social media or stuff like that if you've got any more questions. I'd be happy to help.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks. It was a very, very informative session, and I'm sure plenty of our attendees has benefited from that. So we got next session coming up soon. We got a little small change here. So our pit session has been switched with Anna's session due to some personal emergencies. So what you're going to get now is Anna will be presenting a very interesting session about introduction to CDS, static web apps, and GitHub Actions. Anna, are you there?
I'm here indeed.
Fantastic. So we'll give like 2 minutes if anyone needs a break, 2-minute break, and then we'll kickstart spot on. Yeah.
Amazing. Thanks. Thank you.